He was a boy the town had branded an orphan and left to starve. She was a woman they had branded a sinner and left to bleed in the street. When he reached for her hand, it wasn't a plea for help. It was a declaration. He chose the town's fallen woman to be his mother. Their union was a scandal born of desperation, a bond forged between two souls with nothing left to lose. But in a town built on judgment, their choice was not an ending, but the first shot in a war for the right to call each other family. Tommy Garrett pressed his face against the jailhouse window, watching Sheriff Morrison drag another drunk into a cell. The boy's stomach cramped with hunger, but he didn't move from his spot on the wooden crate someone had left by the wall. 3 days now since Uncle Pete died in that stupid fight over cards. 3 days since anyone had spoken to him except to tell him to get out of the way. The townspeople whispered when they thought he couldn't hear them. Orphan boy. No family left. What's to become of him now? But none of them opened their doors when night fell, and the desert cold crept in. The sheriff emerged from the jail keys jangling and spotted Tommy huddled against the building. "Boy, you can't stay here forever," Morrison said. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house might have worked for you. Sweeping floors or some such. Tommy had already tried Mrs. Patterson. She'd taken one look at his torn clothes and dirty face and shut the door before he could get a word out. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew Pete Garrett had been a drunk and a gambler, and apparently his nephew carried the same stain. Tommy slid off the crate and wandered down Main Street past the general store where Mr. Chin pretended not to see him, eyeing the bread past the church where Reverend Walsh had promised to pray for his soul, but offered nothing for his empty belly. The afternoon heat beat down mercilessly, but Tommy barely felt it anymore. He'd grown used to feeling hollow, hungry, tired, forgot. At 7 years old, he understood that the world had no place for boys like him. That's when he heard the shouting. A crowd had gathered outside Roz's saloon, voices raised in anger and disgust. Tommy pushed through the forest of legs until he could see what had captured everyone's attention. A woman sat in the dirt, her dress torn at the shoulder, blood trickling from her split lip. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her face. But when she lifted her head, Tommy saw eyes that held the same hollowness he felt in his chest. "Scarlet me, you're a disgrace," spat Mrs. Morrison, the sheriff's wife. "Decent women don't carry on like you do." Other voices joined in a chorus of judgment that made Tommy's hands clench into fists. He knew that tone. It was the same one they used when they talked about his uncle, the same one they'd started using about him. The woman in the dirt, Scarlet Me, tried to stand, but swayed dangerously. No one moved to help her. Without thinking, Tommy darted forward and grabbed her arm, steadying her as she found her footing. The crowd fell silent, shocked that the orphan boy would touch the fallen woman. Scarlet Me looked down at him with surprise, her green eyes wide and questioning. "Thank you, little one," she whispered, her voice arse but gentle. Tommy felt something warm spread through his chest, the first kindness he'd received in days. "Get away from her, boy," Reverend Walsh commanded, stepping forward with his Bible clutched against his chest. "That woman is poison. You don't want her corruption touching you." But Tommy didn't step away. Instead, he looked up at Scarlet Me and saw something the adults couldn't see. She was just as lost and unwanted as he was, maybe more so. Scarlet Me wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand and straightened her torn dress as best she could. "I'll be on my way," she said, to the crowd, voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. But as she turned to leave, Tommy made a choice that would change both their lives forever. He reached out and took her hand. The gesture sent a ripple of gasps through the crowd. "Tommy, no." Mrs. Chen called out, "You don't understand what she is." But Tommy did understand. He understood perfectly. She was like him. Someone the world had decided wasn't worth saving. The difference was, she was big enough to fight back. And maybe, just maybe, she was lonely enough to want someone to fight for. Scarlet Me stared down at the small hand gripping hers. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, tears filled her eyes. Not tears of shame or pain, but something else entirely hope maybe, or recognition. Here was a child the town had thrown away, just like they'd thrown her away. And he was choosing her despite everything they'd told him about what she was. "Come on then," Scarlet Me said softly, her fingers tightening around Tommy's small hand. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as they walked down Main Street together, whispers following in their wake like poison on the wind. Tommy felt the weight of every stare, every shocked gasp, but he didn't let go. For the first time in 3 days, he wasn't walking alone. Scarlet Me's room above the saloon was smaller than the jail cell Tommy had been sleeping beside, but it was clean and smelled like lavender soap instead of whiskey and vomit. She had a real bed with quilts, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a wooden chair by the single window that looked out over the alley behind the building. Tommy had never seen anything so fine. Scarlet Me noticed him staring and managed a small smile despite her swollen lip. "It's not much," she said, pouring water from a pitcher into the basin, "but it's mine." She dipped a cloth in the water and began cleaning the blood from her face, wincing as she touched the tender spots. Tommy watched her reflection in the mirror and saw how her hands shook, how her eyes kept darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst in and drag her back to the street. "Are you scared?" Tommy asked, his voice small in the quiet room. Scarlet May paused cloth halfway to her cheek and met his eyes in the mirror. For a moment, Tommy thought she might lie the way adults always did when they thought children couldn't handle the truth. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Every day," she admitted, turning to face him. "But less so now that you're here." She knelt down so they were at eye level, her torn dress pooling around her like a broken flower. "What's your name, little one?" When Tommy told her, she smiled for real this time, and it transformed her whole face. "Well, Tommy Garrett, I'm Scarlet My Winters, and if you're staying with me, we need to get some rules straight." The rules were simple, but foreign to Tommy's experience. No going to bed hungry. If there was food, they shared it. No lying to each other. The world had enough liars already. And no matter what anyone said about them about her, they stuck together. "Can you do that?" Scarlet Me asked, extending her pinky finger. Tommy had seen other children make these promises, but no adult had ever offered him one. He linked his small finger with hers and felt something settle in his chest, something he'd never had before belonging. That first night, Scarlet May made soup from a single potato and some salt pork. She'd been saving, stretching it thin, but making sure Tommy got the bigger portion. They ate by candlelight while she told him stories about places she'd been, cities with buildings that reached toward the sky, and rivers so wide you couldn't see the other side. Tommy listened with wonder, forgetting for a while that the world below wanted nothing to do with either of them. But the peace couldn't last. Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced trouble before the pounding on the door began. "Open up, Scarlet." Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed through the thin wood. "Town council wants words with you." Scarlet Me's face went pale, but she squared her shoulders and opened the door. Morrison stood there with 3 other men, Reverend Walsh Mayor Hutchkins and Dr. Bradley, the town's most respected citizens. "This has gone too far," Reverend Walsh declared, pushing past Scarlet Me into the small room. His eyes found Tommy sitting at the little table, and his face hardened with disgust. "That boy belongs in a proper Christian home, not here with you." Mayor Hutchkins nodded agreement, his fat face red with self-righteousness. "We've arranged for him to go to the territorial orphanage in Phoenix. Stage leaves tomorrow." Tommy's blood turned to ice water. Ice. He'd heard stories about the orphanage. Children worked like slaves, beaten for the smallest infractions, forgotten by the world until they aged out with nothing but the clothes on their backs. He looked at Scarlet Me, pleading with his eyes, but she was staring down the 4 men with a fury that made her seem twice her size. "He's not going anywhere," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Tommy chose to stay with me and I chose to take him in. That's the end of it." Dr. Bradley laughed a cold sound that made Tommy shrink back toward the wall. "You think a shun has any legal right to a child? You're deluded, woman. The boy needs proper guidance education, moral instruction, things you clearly can't provide." The word hit Scarlet me like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she moved to stand between Tommy and the men, her body a shield against their judgment. "I may be what you say I am," she said quietly, "but I've never hurt a child. I've never turned my back on someone who needed help. Can all of you say the same?" Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his gun belt, not in threat, but in nervous habit. "Scarlet, be reasonable. The boy needs schooling, needs to learn a trade. What kind of future does he have here?" But Tommy had been silent long enough. The thought of being dragged away from the first person who'd shown him kindness in weeks made something fierce and desperate rise in his throat. "I won't go," he said, his small voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Scarlet me is good to me. She feeds me and tells me stories and doesn't call me names like everyone else does. If you take me away from her, I'll just run back." He looked each man in the eye with a boldness that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "She's my mama now." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Reverend Walsh sputtered about blasphemy and corruption. Mayor Hutchkins muttered about proper procedures and legal guardianship. But Tommy saw the tears streaming down Scarlet Mai's cheeks and knew he'd said exactly what he meant to say. She was his mama now, chosen not by blood or law, but by something deeper, the recognition that they belonged together in a world that wanted neither of them. Dr. Bradley's face turned purple with rage at Tommy's declaration. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," he spat, jabbing a finger toward Scarlet me. "You've already corrupted the boy's mind, filled it with your poison. No decent child would choose to live in sin over proper Christian upbringing." But Tommy stepped closer to Scarlet me, his small hand finding hers again, and the gesture spoke louder than any argument. "Get out, Scarlet." Me said, her voice steady, despite the tears still tracking down her cheeks. "All of you, this is my room, and Tommy is my family now. You have no right to be here." Mayor Hutchkins puffed up like an angry toad, ready to bluster about legal authority and moral obligation. But Sheriff Morrison held up a hand to stop him. The sheriff had been watching Tommy's face throughout the confrontation, and what he saw there gave him pause. "We'll be back with papers," Morrison said quietly. "Legal documents. The territorial judge will have the final say about where the boy belongs." He looked directly at Tommy, then his weathered face showing more compassion than his companions possessed. "Son, I know you think you're making the right choice, but children don't always know what's best for them. Sometimes adults have to make hard decisions." After the men left, Scarlet May sank into the wooden chair by the window, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. Tommy climbed onto her lap without asking permission, wrapping his thin arms around her neck. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding of a bond that had formed faster and stronger than either had thought possible. "They'll come back," Scarlet me whispered, finally her arms tightening around the small boy. "They'll take you away from me, and there's nothing I can do to stop them. I have no money for lawyers, no standing in this community, no rights that any of them recognize." The despair in her voice broke Tommy's heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. He pulled back to look at her face, his young eyes blazing with determination. "Then we'll leave," he said simply. "Tonight before they come back with their papers." Scarlet me stared at him in shock, caught between admiration for his courage and terror at the thought of running away with a child. "Tommy, sweetheart, we can't just disappear. They'll hunt us down, bring us back, and then things will be even worse for both of us." But Tommy had already started planning his mind racing with possibilities he'd never considered before. "Uncle Pete used to talk about California," he said urgently. "Said there were places out there where people didn't ask too many questions about your past, where you could start over fresh. We could go there, Mama. We could be a real family where nobody knows what we used to be." The word Mama sent a fresh wave of tears down Scarlet Mai's face. But these were different tears. Tears of wonder, of gratitude, of a fierce protectiveness she'd never felt before. In 3 short days, this abandoned boy had become the most important thing in her world, and the thought of losing him to the orphanage felt like having her heart torn from her chest. "It would be dangerous," she said slowly, testing the idea even as part of her recoiled from it. "We don't have money for passage supplies, proper clothes. We'd be traveling alone through territory where anything could happen." But even as she listed the obstacles, Tommy could see something changing in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or desperation strong enough to overcome fear. A sudden commotion outside made them both freeze. Angry voices, the sound of breaking glass, heavy boots on the stairs. Scarlet May pushed Tommy behind her, just as the door burst open without so much as a knock. Jake Morrison, the sheriff's worthless son, stood in the doorway with two of his drinking companions, all three of them reeking of whiskey and malice. "Well, well," Jake slurred his eyes, moving from Scarlet Me to Tommy with a mixture of lust and cruelty that made the boy's skin crawl. "Heard you've taken up playing house with orphan trash. That's a new low even for you, Scarlet." His friends laughed like hyenas, emboldened by drink and the knowledge that no one would come to help a fallen woman and a homeless child. "Get out, Jake," Scarlet Me said. But her voice lacked the authority it had held with his father and the other town leaders. These weren't men who cared about appearances or reputation. They were predators who'd found easy prey. Jake stepped into the room, his friends following, and suddenly the small space felt suffocating. "Now that's no way to treat old friends," Jake said, reaching out to touch Scarlet Me's face. She jerked away, but there was nowhere to go in the tiny room. "My daddy and his friends might think you're too good for their tastes, but we're not so particular." His hand grabbed her wrist, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises, and Tommy saw red. Without thinking, the 7-year-old boy launched himself at Jake Morrison like a wild cat, his small fists pounding against the man's legs and stomach. "Don't touch my mama," he screamed, putting every ounce of rage and fear into the words. Jake cursed and backhanded Tommy across the face, sending the boy sprawling against the wall. The crack of flesh against flesh echoed through the room like a gunshot. Scarlet Me's world exploded into fury. She grabbed the water pitcher from the washstand and brought it down on Jake's head with enough force to shatter the ceramic and send him staggering backward. "You touch that boy again, and I'll kill you," she snarled, her voice so deadly that even Jake's drunk friends took a step back. Blood streamed down Jake's forehead, but his eyes were clearer now, focused and dangerous. "You crazy bitch," he growled, wiping blood from his eyes. "Nobody hits a Morrison and gets away with it. Nobody." He lunged for Scarlet Me, but she was ready for him this time. The broken handle of the pitcher made an effective weapon, and she wielded it like a dagger, catching Jake across the cheek and opening a gash that would scar him for life. The three men stumbled out of the room, Jake holding a bandana to his bleeding face and promising vengeance that made Tommy's blood run cold. "This ain't over," Jake snarled from the doorway. "Not by a long shot. Tomorrow morning, you and that brat will be gone from this town one way or another. My daddy might have rules about how to handle trash like you, but I don't." After they left, Scarlet Me rushed to Tommy's side, gently examining the bruise blooming across his small cheek. Her hands shook as she touched the tender skin rage and guilt wearing in her chest. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered. "This is my fault. I brought this down on you." But Tommy caught her hands in his young face serious beyond his years. "No, Mama," he said firmly. "This is their fault. Mean people hurt others because they cannot, because they have to." He looked toward the window where the last light of day was fading into purple twilight. "But you're right about one thing. We can't stay here anymore. They'll keep coming back. And next time they might hurt you worse." Scarlet Mine knew he was right, but the reality of what they were contemplating hit her like a physical blow. Running away with a child meant becoming outlaws, fugitives from whatever justice the territorial authorities might impose. But staying meant watching Tommy get dragged away to an orphanage while she faced whatever vengeance Jake Morrison could devise. The choice, when stripped of all pretense, was no choice at all. "Act light," she said, moving to the small trunk where she kept her few precious possessions. "Only what we absolutely need. We leave when the moon sets while the town's asleep." Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding that they were crossing a line they could never uncross. But as he watched Scarlett Mai carefully fold the one good dress she owned, he felt no fear, only anticipation for the adventure ahead and gratitude for the woman who'd chosen to face an uncertain future rather than abandon him to a certain hell. They waited until the saloon below fell silent, until even the most dedicated drinkers had stumbled home or passed out in the alley. Scarlett Mai had sewn her small savings into the lining of her coat 1732, barely enough for food and supplies for a week, let alone passage to California. But it was all they had, and it would have to be enough. Tommy sat on the bed, clutching a small wooden horse Uncle Pete had carved for him years ago, the only thing he owned that carried any memory of love. "Ready, Scarlett Mai," whispered, shouldering the canvas bag that held their worldly possessions. Tommy nodded, though his heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst from his chest. They crept down the back stairs, avoiding the loose board that squeaked, and slipped out through the kitchen door that led to the alley. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. They'd made it 3 blocks from the saloon when the shots rang out. Not aimed at them. The gunfire came from Main Street, followed by shouting and the sound of running feet. Scarlett Mai pulled Tommy into the shadows between 2 buildings, her hand over his mouth to muffle any sound. Through the gap, they could see torches bobbing in the darkness. Men's voices raised in anger and excitement. "Spread out!" someone yelled. Jake Morrison's voice thick with drink but deadly serious. "They can't have gotten far. Check every building, every hiding place. I want them found before sunrise." More men joined the hunt, their voices echoing off the wooden storefronts. Tommy felt Scarlett Mai's body tense beside him as she realized the truth. They weren't just running away anymore. They were being hunted. The old mine shaft. Scarlett Mai breathed in Tommy's ear so quietly he almost missed it. "Behind the cemetery. We can hide there until they give up searching." It meant going deeper into the desert instead of toward the main road, but Tommy understood the wisdom in it. No one would think to look for them in a place the town had abandoned years ago. They moved like ghosts through the back alleys, keeping to the shadows and freezing whenever they heard voices or footsteps. Tommy's legs ached from crouching and creeping, but he didn't complain. He could hear the fear in Scarlett Mai's breathing, see the way her eyes darted constantly from shadow to shadow, and he knew their lives depended on staying hidden. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the town, its weathered headstones casting long shadows in the moonlight. Tommy had always been afraid of this place, with its iron gate that creaked in the wind, and its whispered stories of restless spirits. But tonight, surrounded by the dead, felt safer than facing the living who wanted to tear them apart. They picked their way carefully between the graves, Scarlett Mai leading them toward the far side where the old mining operation had left its scars on the landscape. The entrance to the shaft was partially collapsed, hidden behind a tangle of mesquite and tumbleweeds. Scarlett Mai had to crawl on her hands and knees to squeeze through the opening, pulling Tommy behind her into the musty darkness. The air inside was stale and cold, but it was shelter, and more importantly, it was invisible to anyone searching from the outside. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the search parties moving through town. Tommy could feel Scarlett Mai shivering, though, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "Mama," he whispered the word coming naturally now, without thought or hesitation. "Are we going to be okay?" He needed the reassurance needed to hear her voice steady and sure, even if she was lying. "Yes, baby," she whispered back, her arms tightening around him. "We're going to be just fine. Tomorrow night we'll start walking toward the railroad tracks. There's a water stop about 10 Mir West, where the freight trains take on supplies. If we're careful, we can catch a ride without anyone seeing us." She spoke with more confidence than she felt. But Tommy needed hope, and she would give him that even if it was all she had left to offer. But their hiding place wasn't as secure as they'd hoped. As dawn broke grey and uncertain over the desert, they heard voices much closer than before. Jake Morrison and 2 other men, their boots crunching on the rocky ground outside the mine entrance. "Check every hole, Every cave Jake was saying, his voice from a night of shouting orders. They're like rats. They've gone to ground somewhere close. Scarlet Me pressed her hand over Tommy's mouth again, her own breathing so shallow it barely stirred the dust around them. The voices grew closer, and suddenly a beam of lantern light pierced the gloom of their hiding place. Tommy's heart stopped as heavy footsteps approached the entrance to the shaft. They were trapped, cornered, like the rats Jake had compared them to, with nowhere left to run. "What about this old mine?" one of the searchers asked, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Looks like something might have been through here recently." The light grew brighter, probing deeper into their sanctuary. Scarlet Me gathered Tommy closer, preparing to shield him with her own body if necessary. She'd fight to her last breath before she let them take her boy. But salvation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Bradley's voice, sharp with authority, cut through the morning air. "Jake Morrison, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" The searchers froze, caught like children with their hands in the cookie jar. "Your father sent me to find you. There's been an accident at the mill. 2 men hurt badly. We need every available hand, not this nonsense about chasing shadows." Jake's voice was sullen, reluctant. "They're out here somewhere, Doc. I know they are. Just give me another hour." But Dr. Bradley wouldn't be swayed, his medical authority trumping even a Morrison's wounded pride. "The mill, Jake, now. Those men might die if we don't get them help immediately." The voices moved away, the lantern light fading as the searchers were called to more pressing duties. Scarlet Me and Tommy remained frozen in their hiding place long after the voices faded, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. When the sun was fully up and the sounds of normal morning activity drifted up from the town below, they finally dared to whisper to each other. "We can't stay here, Scarlet," Me said, her voice cracked with exhaustion and strain. "They'll be back as soon as they deal with whatever happened at the mill." Tommy nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to burrow deeper into their dark sanctuary. The idea of leaving their hiding place in broad daylight terrified him, but he trusted Scarlet Me's judgment completely. If she said they had to move, then they had to move. "Where do we go?" he asked, trying to keep his voice as brave as possible. "There's an old line shack about 5 mi north," she said, thinking aloud, more than answering his question. "Used to belong to the cattle ranch before they moved their operation closer to water. If it's still standing, it might give us shelter until tonight." She paused, studying Tommy's small face in the dim light filtering through the mine entrance. "It means traveling during the day, staying off the main paths, hiding whenever we see or hear anyone coming. Can you do that?" Tommy squared his small shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed. "I can do anything if you're with me, Mama." The simple faith in his voice nearly broke Scarlet Me's heart, but it also strengthened her resolve. This boy had chosen her when the whole world said she wasn't worth choosing. She would move heaven and earth before she let anyone tear them apart. They waited until the search parties had been gone for over an hour before venturing out of the mine shaft. The morning sun was harsh after the cool darkness, making them both squint and stumble as their eyes adjusted. Scarlet Me led them away from town, following deer trails and dry creek beds that would hide their passage from casual observers. Every sound made them freeze. A bird taking flight, a rock rolling down a slope, the distant lowing of cattle. The line shack, when they finally found it, was little more than a skeleton of weathered boards and a partially collapsed roof, but it offered some shade from the climbing sun and concealment from anyone who might be looking for 2 figures moving across the open desert. They collapsed in the meager shelter, exhausted from fear, and walking, sharing the last of the bread Scarlet Me had saved from their flight. As Tommy dozed fitfully in the heat of the day, Scarlet Me kept watch through gaps in the broken walls. In the distance, she could see dust clouds that might have been riders, but whether they were searchers or just travelers on the main road, she couldn't tell. What she could tell was that every hour that passed made their situation more desperate. Their water was almost gone, their food was finished, and they were still at least 2 days' walk from the railroad tracks that represented their only hope of escape. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they prepared to move again. Tommy's lips were cracked from thirst, and Scarlet Me's hands shook as she helped him to his feet. They had perhaps a mouthful of water left between them, and the railroad track still seemed impossibly far away. But giving up wasn't an option. Not when freedom lay just beyond the next ridge, the next mile, the next step forward. They'd been walking for less than an hour when they heard the horses. The sound carried clearly in the thin desert air. Multiple riders moving fast, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. Scarlet Me grabbed Tommy's hand and pulled him toward a cluster of boulders that offered the only cover in sight. They pressed themselves against the sun-warmed rock just as 4 horsemen crested the hill behind them. Jake Morrison rode in the lead, his face a map of cuts and bruises from their encounter the night before. Behind him came his usual companions, plus Sheriff Morrison himself, looking grim and determined. They'd found the tracks leading from the mine shaft, followed the trail with the patience of men who had nothing but time and plenty of motivation to see this through to the end. Fresh Prince, one of the riders, called out, dismounting to examine the sandy ground. Woman and child moving slow can't be more than an hour ahead. Jake's face split into a cruel grin that made Tommy's blood run cold. They'd been so careful, but the desert held onto secrets poorly, and experienced trackers could read their passage like words on a page. Scarlet Me closed her eyes and made a decision that went against every maternal instinct screaming in her chest. She pressed her mouth close to Tommy's ear and whispered words that changed everything between them. When I say run, you go toward those rocks on the other side of the valley. Don't look back. Don't stop. Don't wait for me. Follow the dry creek bed north until you find the railroad tracks. Tommy's eyes went wide with horror. No, Mama, I won't leave you. His small hands clutched at her dress, desperation making his voice higher and younger than his 7 years. We stick together, remember? That was the rule. But Scarlet Mai was already checking the small knife she carried, the only weapon they had against 4 armed men. New rule, she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she spoke. Sometimes people who love each other have to be brave in different ways. Your job is to get to safety. My job is to make sure you have time to do it. She kissed his forehead, tasting salt and dust, and the sweetness of childhood that would be lost forever after today. Be brave, my sweet boy. Be brave and remember that your mama loves you more than life itself. Before Tommy could protest further, Scarlet Me stood up from behind the boulder and called out to the riders, "Looking for me, gentlemen?" Her voice carried across the desert with false bravado, drawing every eye in her direction. The horses wheeled toward her, their riders' attention focused completely on the woman who'd caused them so much trouble. Tommy watched in frozen terror as Jake Morrison spurred his horse forward, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. "Well, well, Scarlet. Me finally decided to face the music, have you?" His voice was ugly with triumph, and something darker. Something that made the boy's stomach clench with primitive fear. "Where's your little bastard? Don't tell me you left him to die out here alone." "He's long gone." Scarlet Me lied smoothly, backing slowly away from the rocks where Tommy lay hidden. Smart boy knew when to cut his losses. He's probably halfway to the territorial capital by now, telling everyone who will listen about how the good Christian folks of Redemption Creek treat their orphans. It was a masterful performance, drawing the writers further from Tommy's hiding place with every word. But Sheriff Morrison wasn't fooled so easily. His weathered eyes scanned the landscape with the patience of a man who'd spent decades reading sign and tracking fugitives. "Jake, take Henderson and circle around those boulders. If the boy is anywhere close, that's where he'll be." The words hit Tommy like physical blows, but Scarlet Mai's voice cut through his panic. "Run!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Run now, Tommy!" And then she was moving not away from the riders, but toward them, the small knife gleaming in her hand as she threw herself at Jake Morrison's horse. The animal reared, whinnying in alarm, and Jake cursed as he fought to keep his seat. Tommy's feet moved without conscious thought, carrying him out from behind the boulder and across the open ground toward the distant rocks. Behind him, he could hear shouts, the crack of gunfire. Scarlet Me's voice raised in defiance and pain. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to help her to stay with the only person who'd ever truly loved him. But her words echoed in his head. Be brave. Remember that your mama loves you. And he kept running. A bullet wed past his ear so close he felt the wind of its passage. Another kicked up sand at his feet, and he realized with sick certainty that they were shooting to wound, not kill. They wanted him alive, wanted to drag him back, to face whatever justice they decided he deserved. But Tommy had learned something important in his 7 short years. Sometimes the only choice left was between different kinds of hell, and at least running gave him a chance to choose his own. He reached the rocks just as hands seized Scarlet Me, dragging her down from Jake's horse, where she'd managed to inflict fresh wounds with her inadequate knife. Tommy pressed himself against the stone and watched through a gap as they bound her hands, as Jake backhanded her across the face, hard enough to snap her head sideways. The boy bit his tongue to keep from crying out tasted blood and tears and the bitter flavor of helplessness. "Where is he?" Jake snarled, grabbing Scarlet Me by the hair and forcing her to look toward the rocks where Tommy hid. "Call him back, or I swear I'll make you regret every breath you've ever drawn." But Scarlet Me only smiled. Blood running from her split lip, her green eyes blazing with fierce pride. "Go to hell, Jake Morrison," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the desert to the boy who needed to hear her strength more than her pain. "That child is worth more than this whole God-forsaken town put together, and if you think I'll help you destroy him, you're even stupider than you look." The words earned her another blow, but she took it without flinching her eyes, never leaving the rocks where she knew Tommy was hidden. Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through his son's rage with cold authority. "Enough, Jake. We'll find the boy our own way." He gestured to the other riders, and Tommy's heart sank as he realized they were spreading out, beginning a systematic search that would inevitably discover his hiding place. There were too many of them, too much open ground to cover and nowhere left to run. But as the riders began their sweep, a new sound echoed across the desert. The sharp blast of a train whistle closer than Tommy had dared hope. The evening freight was making its way toward the water stop. Black smoke rising against the darkening sky. It was still miles away, but it represented Hope's salvation, escape from the nightmare his life had become. Tommy looked one last time at Scarlet Me, memorizing her face, her courage, the way she held her head high, even with her hands bound in blood on her chin. Then he turned away from the rocks and began running again, not toward safety, but toward the sound of that distant whistle, toward a future that might hold freedom if he could just reach it in time. Behind him, shouts erupted as the riders discovered his absence. But Tommy didn't look back. He ran with everything he had, every muscle screaming, every breath burning in his throat, carrying with him the memory of green eyes and gentle hands, and a woman who'd called him son, when the whole world said he wasn't worth saving. She'd given him the greatest gift anyone could give the chance to choose his own fate. Now it was up to him to prove worthy of her sacrifice. The train whistle grew louder as Tommy stumbled down the rocky slope toward the railroad tracks, his small legs pumping with desperate determination. Behind him, he could hear the thunder of hoofbeats as the riders gave chase. Jake Morrison's voice rising above the others in a string of curses that would have made the devil himself blush. But Tommy had something they didn't. Desperation born of love, and the kind of wild courage that only comes to those who have absolutely nothing left to lose. The locomotive appeared around a bend in the tracks, its headlamp cutting through the gathering dusk like a beacon of hope. It was a freight train, long and heavy, moving slower than a passenger express, but still faster than anything Tommy had ever seen up close. Cars loaded with lumber cattle and machinery stretched behind the engine like a metal snake. And somewhere in that rolling fortress was his ticket to freedom. Tommy reached the tracks just as the engine thundered past the ground, shaking beneath his feet from the massive weight of iron and steam. The engineer's face was a pale blur in the cab window too, focused on the rails ahead to notice one small boy standing beside the tracks in the middle of nowhere. car after car rolled by boxcars with their doors sealed shut, flat cars loaded with mining equipment, cattle cars that reared of manure and misery. Then he saw it, an empty boxcar with its door standing partially open, moving past at a speed that terrified him but represented his only chance. Tommy had seen older boys in town jump moving trains before, but they'd been bigger, stronger, more experienced at this deadly game. Still, as the hoof beat-ats behind him grew closer, and Jake Morrison's voice promised unspeakable vengeance, Tommy knew he had to try. He ran alongside the train, matching its speed as best he could on his short legs, reaching for the iron ladder that hung from the side of the boxcar. His first attempt failed his fingers, slipping off the metal rungs as the train's momentum nearly pulled him under the wheels. The second time, his left hand caught hold, but his grip wasn't strong enough to support his weight, and he fell back onto the gravel road, rolling away from the deadly wheels with inches to spare. There he is. Jake Morrison's voice cut through the noise of the train like a blade. The riders had reached the tracks, their horses dancing nervously at the unfamiliar sight and sound of the locomotive. Tommy could see Jake fighting to control his mount while trying to draw his pistol, the animal's fear making accurate shooting impossible. But that wouldn't last long. As soon as the train passed, they'd run him down like a rabbit. Tommy made one last desperate lunge for the ladder, putting every ounce of strength and will he possessed into the attempt. This time, both hands found purchase on the iron rungs, and momentum carried him up against the side of the car with a bone-jarring impact that knocked the breath from his lungs. For a terrifying moment, he hung there like a rag doll, his feet dragging in the gravel, his grip weakening with each passing second. Then strong hands seized his wrists, hauling him up and through the open door of the boxcar in one smooth motion. Tommy collapsed onto the wooden floor, gasping and shaking, unable to believe he was still alive. When his vision cleared, he found himself staring up at a weathered face framed by graying hair and kind eyes that held depths of understanding Tommy had never seen before. "Easy there, son," the man said, his voice gentle despite its roughness. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you while you're under my protection." He helped Tommy sit up, checking for injuries with practiced hands. "Name's Frank Cassidy. I'm what you might call a professional passenger on this particular railroad. And you, I'm guessing, are running from something a lot worse than the law." Through the open door, Tommy could see the riders growing smaller in the distance. Jake Morrison shaking his fist at the departing train in futile rage. The sight should have filled him with relief, but all he could think about was Scarlet Me, still in their hands, still paying the price for his freedom. Tears streamed down his dirt-stained cheeks as the full weight of what had happened finally hit him. "My mama," he whispered, the words torn from his throat like pieces of his soul. "They have my mama, and I left her. I ran away and left her with those terrible men." Frank Cassid's expression darkened as he listened to Tommy's broken explanation, his jaw tightening with anger that had nothing to do with the boy and everything to do with the men who'd put him in this impossible position. "Son, listen to me," Frank said, gripping Tommy's shoulders gently but firmly. "What you did back there wasn't running away. It was obeying your mama's last wish. She wanted you free, wanted you safe, and she was willing to sacrifice everything to make that happen. Don't you dare dishonor that gift by thinking you failed her." His voice carried the authority of a man who'd seen enough of the world to understand the difference between cowardice and courage. As the train carried them through the night, Frank shared his own story. A former soldier who'd lost his family to cholera and taken to the rails rather than face a world that held nothing but empty rooms and bitter memories. He'd been riding the freight lines for 3 years, helping other lost souls when he could, staying one step ahead of a past that had no place for broken men with too much conscience and too little hope. "Where were you planning to go?" Frank asked, as they shared a can of beans he'd produced from his pack. Tommy thought of Scarlet Me's stories about California, about cities where the past didn't matter, and people could become whoever they chose to be. But those dreams seemed impossibly distant, now tainted by the price that had been paid for his freedom. "I don't know," Tommy admitted, his voice small and lost. Mama talked about California, but I don't know anyone there. I don't know anyone anywhere. The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Frank studied the boy's face with eyes that had learned to read hearts as well as horizons. Well, it so happens I was heading west myself, Frank said carefully. Got word of work in the lumber camps up in Oregon. Good, clean work for men who don't ask too many questions about each other's past. If you wanted company on the journey, I wouldn't mind having someone to talk to besides the wheels and the wind. It was an offer wrapped in casual words, but Tommy heard the deeper invitation, family of a sort, for two people who'd lost everything that mattered. The train rolled on through the night, carrying them away from Redemption Creek and toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Tommy dozed fitfully against Frank's shoulder, dreaming of green eyes and gentle hands of a woman who'd chosen love over safety and paid the ultimate price for that choice. When he woke, the sun was rising over mountains he'd never seen before, and the world stretched out ahead of them like a promise written in gold and shadow. "Will I ever see her again?" Tommy asked as they watched the landscape roll past the open door. Frank was quiet for a long moment, weighing truth against comfort, reality against the needs of a child's heart. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard, won wisdom. "Maybe not in this life, son," he said honestly. "But love, like what you two shared, that doesn't just disappear because people get separated. It lives on in the choices you make, the kind of man you become, the way you treat others who need help. Your mama's love is part of you now forever. Nobody can take that away, no matter what else they might do." As the train carried them toward their new life, Tommy pressed his face to the wind and whispered a promise that only Scarlett May could hear. He would grow up strong and kind, would help other lost children find their way to safety, would carry her love forward into a world that needed more people willing to choose compassion over convenience. She had called him son when no one else would claim him, had fought for him when no one else would protect him, had given him a future when his past held only pain. The boy who had been Tommy Garrett was gone, left behind on the desert floor with his childhood and innocence. The young man who would emerge from this crucible would be someone new, someone shaped by love and loss in equal measure, someone who understood that family wasn't about blood or law, but about the choice to stand together against a world that would tear you apart. Scarlett May Winters had taught him that lesson with her life, and he would spend the rest of his days proving worthy of the gift she'd given him. In years to come, when Tommy had grown into a man who helped runaway children find sanctuary, when he'd built schools and orphanages and safe houses for those the world had forgotten, people would ask him where he'd learned such compassion. And he would smile and tell them about a woman in a dusty town who'd seen worth in a worthless boy, who'd called him son when he had no one who'd shown him that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born with. His mama would always be his mama, and nothing, not distance, not time, not even death itself could change that truth. The train whistled its lonely song as it carried them toward tomorrow, and Tommy closed his eyes and felt Scarlett May's love surrounding him, like a blessing, like a promise, like the beginning of a story that would never truly end. 23 years later, the man who had once been Tommy Garrett stood on the platform of the Redemption Creek railway station, watching the same freight line that had carried him to freedom all those years ago. His name was Thomas Cassidy, now taken in honor of the man who'd become his father in every way that mattered, and the boy who'd fled in terror had grown into someone the town barely recognized. Tall and broad-shouldered, with Frank's quiet strength and Scarlett May's compassionate eyes, he cut an impressive figure in his well-tailored coat and polished boots. The telegram in his pocket had arrived 3 days ago, bearing news that had torn open wounds he'd thought had healed decades before. Jake Morrison was dead killed in a saloon fight over a poker game, and Sheriff Morrison had followed his son to the grave just hours later, his heart giving out from the shock and shame of what his family had become. But it wasn't their deaths that had brought Thomas back to this God-forsaken place. It was what the lawyer's letter had revealed about Scarlett May's fate. She was alive. After 23 years of believing she'd died in that desert, paying the ultimate price for his freedom, Thomas had learned the truth that changed everything. Scarlett Mee Winters was alive, and she was waiting for him in the place where their story had begun. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow, joy and terror roaring in his chest as he tried to process what this meant, what had changed, what it demanded of him. The town had shrunk since his childhood, the buildings more weathered, the streets less travelled. The saloon where Scarlett Mee had lived still stood, though it bore a different name now, and catered to a gentler clientele. The sheriff's office looked smaller than he remembered, and the jail that had once seemed so imposing was revealed as nothing more than a few cells behind a desk where frightened men had pretended their authority meant something. Thomas walked slowly down Main Street, his expensive boots clicking on the same boardwalks where he'd once begged for scraps, where decent people had crossed to avoid contamination from an orphan boy's presence. A few old-timers recognized something familiar in his face, but none connected the successful businessman with the terrified child who'd vanished one night with the town's most notorious woman. He was a ghost returning to haunt a place that had tried its best to forget him. The house on Willow Street was painted white now, with flower boxes in the windows, and a neat picket fence that spoke of respectability earned through decades of quiet living. Thomas stood at the gate for a full minute, his hand trembling as it reached for the latch. 23 years of wondering, of grieving, of carrying the weight of her sacrifice. All of it came down to this moment, this choice to walk through a gate and face the woman who'd given him everything when he had nothing to offer in return. She opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been watching from the window, waiting for this day, with the same desperate hope that had carried him across a continent. Scarlett Mee Winters was 51 years old now, her dark hair touched with silver, her face lined with years of hard work and harder choices. But her green eyes were exactly as he remembered them. Bright with intelligence, soft with compassion, blazing with the fierce love that had shaped his entire life. "Tommy," she whispered, and the name hit him like a benediction, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. "My sweet boy, look how tall you've grown." She stepped onto the porch with careful dignity, her hands clasped in front of her, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to touch him, to claim him, to call him son after all these years apart. Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything, but stare at the miracle standing before him. She was alive. She was whole. She was here. All the success he'd built, all the lives he'd saved, all the good he'd done in the world, none of it had filled the hole her absence had left in his heart. But now she was here, and he was 7 years old again, desperate for the comfort only she could provide. "Mama?" He said the word, breaking free from his throat, like a prayer answered. And then he was crossing the distance between them, gathering her into his arms with all the careful reverence of a man holding the most precious thing in his world. She felt smaller than he remembered, more fragile. But when her arms came up to encircle his neck, she was exactly as strong as the woman who'd faced down 4 armed men to give him a chance at freedom. They held each other on that porch as the sun set over Redemption Creek. 23 years of separation collapsing into nothing more than a bad dream. Neighbors peered from their windows, whispering about the elegant stranger, embracing the woman they'd learned to respect but never quite accept. Let them whisper, Thomas thought fiercely. Let them wonder and gossip and judge. None of it mattered now that he'd found her again. Inside her small, neat parlor, over tea, served in cups that had seen better days but were polished to gleaming perfection. Scarlett Mee told him the story he'd never known. How Sheriff Morrison had locked her in jail for 3 days before releasing her with a warning to leave town and never return. How she'd walked to the next settlement with nothing but the clothes on her back and the memory of a boy's courage to sustain her. How she'd worked as a seamstress, a cook, a cleaner, any honest job that would have her slowly building a life that meant something beyond mere survival. "I wrote letters," she said, her voice thick with old pain. "Dozens of them to every railroad station, every town hall, every church between here and California, looking for news of a boy named Tommy Garrett, trying to find out if you'd made it to safety. But you'd vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed you whole." Thomas explained about Frank Cassidy, about the new name and the new life they'd built together in Oregon, about the lumber camps and the schools, the orphanages, and the children who'd found sanctuary in the institutions he'd established with money earned through years of backbreaking work and careful investment. Every choice he'd made, every dollar he'd saved, every child he'd helped, all of it had been in service to the love she'd taught him, the lesson she'd burned into his soul with her sacrifice. "I came back once," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the teacup in her trembling hands. "About 10 years ago, when I'd saved enough money to buy this house to live like a decent woman instead of a vagrant, I thought maybe you'd come looking for me someday, and I wanted to be where you'd think to find me. But I also wanted to face this place to show them that the woman they tried to destroy had survived and thrived despite their cruelty." And Jake Morrison? Thomas asked, though part of him already knew the answer, from the shadows that crossed her face. "What did he do to you? After I got away, Scarlet Me was quiet for a long moment, weighing what truth he needed to hear against what truth she could bear to tell. He hurt me," she said simply. "But he didn't break me, and every bruise he left, every cruel word he spoke. It all just reminded me that I'd done the right thing, that you were free and safe, and growing up somewhere far from his poison." She reached across the small table and took his hands in hers, her fingers tracing the calluses that spoke of honest work and honorable choices. "You became everything I dreamed you could be, Tommy. Everything I hoped for when I told you to run." As the night deepened around them, they shared 23 years of stories. His triumphs and failures, her struggles and small victories, the lives they'd built apart, but always in memory of each other. Thomas told her about Frank Cassid's death 5 years earlier, how the old soldier had lived long enough to see his adopted son become a man worth respecting before passing peacefully in his sleep. Scarlet Me wept for the man she'd never met, but who'd given her boy the father he deserved. "Will you stay?" she asked, as the clock on the mantel chimed midnight. "I know you have a life in Oregon, responsibilities, people who depend on you, but I've been alone for so long, and now that I've found you again." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the desperate hope that had sustained her through decades of solitude. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his serious face into something that reminded her powerfully of the brave little boy who'd chosen her when no one else would. "Mama, I've spent 23 years building something worth coming home to. Now, I want to spend whatever time we have left building something worth staying for together." In the morning, Thomas Cassidy would begin the process of moving his operations to Arizona territory, establishing new schools and orphanages within a day's ride of Redemption Creek. He would use his wealth and influence to transform the bitter little town into a place where lost children could find sanctuary, where fallen women could earn redemption, where the kind of love that had saved him could flourish and grow. But tonight, he was simply Tommy, again sitting beside the woman who'd called him son when he had nowhere else to belong. Finally home after a lifetime of searching for the place where his heart could rest. Outside, the desert wind sang the same lonely song it had sung 23 years before. But inside the little house on Willow Street, two souls who'd been torn apart by cruelty had found each other again. Love had won, as it always did when people were brave enough to choose it over fear, to fight for it despite impossible odds. To believe that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than anything the world can tear apart. Scarlet My Winters had taught her son that lesson with her life. And Thomas Cassidy would spend the rest of his days proving that some gifts are too precious, to waste some loves too powerful, to break some families too strong for time or distance, or even death itself to destroy. She was his mama, would always be his mama, and together they would write the ending their story had always deserved. 6 months after Thomas Cassidy returned to Redemption Creek, the town had begun to transform in ways that made the old-timers shake their heads and mutter about the world changing too fast for decent folk to follow. The first sign had been the construction crews that arrived on the morning train, followed by wagons loaded with lumberglass and the kind of fine materials that spoke of serious money being spent on serious projects. By the time the townspeople realized what was happening, Thomas had already purchased half the buildings on Main Street and begun converting them into something the territory had never seen before. The Cassidy Foundation, as the brass plaque on the new brick building proclaimed, wasn't just another business venture or mining speculation. It was a promise made manifest, a dream, given form and substance in wood and stone, and the sweat of honest workers who'd been hired at wages that made other employers grumble about unfair competition. Thomas had brought more than money back to Redemption Creek. He brought hope, and hope was a dangerous thing in a place that had grown comfortable with despair. "You're making enemies, son." Scarlett Mee warned him one evening as they sat on her front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "Mrs. Patterson's been spreading poison about you all over town, claiming you're trying to destroy the natural order of things. And the new Sheriff Morrison's replacement, he's been asking questions about your business, wanting to know where all this money came from." Thomas smiled the expression, holding none of the bitterness that might have been expected from a man returning to the place that had tried to destroy him. Instead, his face showed the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that the best revenge was a life lived well, and the sweetest victory was one that lifted others as it elevated yourself. "Let them ask their questions, Mama. Every dollar I've spent here was earned through honest work, and every project I've started serves a purpose they'll understand soon enough." The first test of his resolve came when young Billy Chen arrived at the foundation's doors, his face swollen with fresh bruises, and his clothes torn from running through the desert brush. His father had died in a mining accident 2 weeks earlier, and his mother had succumbed to grief in Ladynam 3 days later, leaving the 12-year-old boy to face the world with nothing but the clothes on his back and the kind of hollow desperation that Thomas recognized like looking in a mirror. "Please, mister," Billy gasped, collapsing on the foundation's front steps as Thomas emerged from a meeting with the Territorial Education Commissioner. "I heard you help kids who ain't got nowhere else to go. My ma's dead. My pa's dead. And Mrs. Patterson says she won't take in no Chinese orphan, not even for the county money. Says it wouldn't be proper for white children to associate with my kind." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, carrying him back 23 years to another desperate child, begging for basic human kindness from a world that had already decided he wasn't worth saving. But this time, things would be different. This time, there was someone with the power to change the story's ending. Someone who remembered what it felt like to be utterly alone and completely abandoned. "Billy Chen," Thomas said, kneeling down so they were at eye level, his voice gentle, but absolutely certain. "You're not alone anymore, and you're never going to be alone again. Not as long as I draw breath in this world." He helped the boy to his feet, noting the way Billy's shoulders straightened with the first hope he'd felt since his parents died. "Welcome to your new home, son. Welcome to your new family." The reaction from the town was swift and predictably ugly. Within hours of Billy's arrival at the foundation, a delegation of concerned citizens had assembled on the building's front steps, led by Mrs. Patterson and backed by a dozen other self-appointed guardians of public morality. Their voices carried clearly through the evening air, sharp with indignation and thick with the kind of righteous anger that masked deeper, uglier emotions. "This is an outrage!" Mrs. Patterson declared, her face flushed with the fervour of someone who'd found a cause worthy of her bile. Bad enough that Scarlett Mee Winters corrupted one child with her influence. But now, Thomas Cassidy thinks he can force decent people to accept his charity cases and foreign orphans. It's an affront to everything this community stands for. Thomas emerged from the foundation building with Billy at his side, the boy's hand firmly clasped in his own. Behind them came Scarlett Mee, her chin raised with the same defiant pride she'd shown when facing down Jake Morrison, all those years ago. The sight of her standing with Thomas sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Many of them had forgotten that the respected seamstress who'd quietly served their community for a decade was the same woman they'd once driven from their streets. "Mrs. Patterson," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the gathering with the kind of authority that money and success had given him. "I appreciate your concern for the welfare of children, but I'm afraid you're misinformed about several important facts. First, Billy Chen is an American citizen born in this territory to parents who worked harder and contributed more to this community than most of the people standing behind you. Second, the Foundation operates under a charter granted by the territorial government, which means your approval, while valued, isn't required for us to fulfill our mission. Dr. Bradley, now greyer and more stooped than Thomas remembered, pushed through the crowd to stand beside Mrs. Patterson. Mission. He scoffed, his voice carrying the same arrogance that had marked his character decades earlier. Your mission seems to be corrupting decent society with the same poison that woman spread 23 years ago. We know who you really are, boy. We know where you came from and what you represent. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, and Thomas felt the weight of every eye in the crowd as they waited to see how he would respond. This was the moment he'd been preparing for since the day Frank Cassidy had pulled him from that boxcar. The moment when his past and present would collide, when he would either stand tall or crumble under the weight of other people's judgment. You're absolutely right, Dr. Bradley, Thomas said, his voice steady and clear. You do know where I came from. I'm Tommy Garrett, the orphan boy who knocked on doors begging for work and was turned away by every decent family in this town. I'm the child who chose Scarlett My Winters when she was the only person willing to show me kindness, who learned about love and sacrifice and what it means to be family from the woman you all called Ada. The crowd stirred uneasily, whispers rippling through their ranks as the full implications of his words sank in. Thomas stepped forward, his hand never leaving Billy's, his eyes moving from face to face with the kind of calm assessment that made grown men squirm, like school children caught in mischief. I'm also the man who built 3 schools and 2 orphanages in Oregon, who's helped more than 200 children find homes and futures when the world had written them off as worthless. I'm the businessman whose investments have created jobs for more than 1,000 families, whose charitable foundation has fed and clothed and educated children from here to California. His voice grew stronger, with each word carrying the weight of accomplishments earned through decades of honest work. And I'm the son who came home to honor the woman who taught me that love isn't about bloodlines or social standing. It's about choosing to stand with someone when the whole world stands against them. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale during Thomas's speech, but she rallied with the desperate fury of someone whose worldview was crumbling beneath her feet. Pretty words, she spat, but they don't change what you are. Trash raised by trash. Thinking money can buy you respectability. That boy belongs in a proper Christian home, not with degenerates who. She never finished the sentence. Billy Chen, all of 12 years old and barely reaching Thomas's shoulder, stepped forward with a dignity that put every adult in the crowd to shame. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his young voice carrying across the evening air with perfect clarity. "I've been in your proper Christian home. You fed me scraps and made me sleep in the shed with the animals while you told everyone in town how charitable you were being. Mr. Cassidy gave me clean clothes, a warm bed, and 3 meals today. More kindness in one afternoon than I got in 2 weeks under your roof." The boy's words hit the crowd like a slap, exposing the ugly truth behind their righteous indignation. Several people shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding the ground or the sky more interesting than the confrontation playing out before them. Even Dr. Bradley seemed to deflate slightly, his bluster leaking away as he realized how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered by a man who'd learned to fight with weapons they didn't understand. Truth, compassion, and the kind of moral authority that came from actually helping people instead of just talking about it. Thomas placed his hand on Billy's shoulder, pride evident in every line of his body. "This is what the Foundation stands for," he said, addressing not just the crowd, but the entire town that had gathered to watch the confrontation. "Children like Billy, like I used to be, deserve more than your scraps and condescension. They deserve love, education, opportunity, a chance to become whatever God intended them to be, and they're going to get it whether you approve or not." As the crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves and shooting uncertain glances, back at the Foundation building, Scarlett Me moved to stand beside Thomas and Billy. 3 generations of the discarded and unwanted now, united by bonds stronger than blood, facing down a world that had tried its best to break them. The boy who'd been called worthless had become a man of influence. The woman who'd been called fallen had earned respect through quiet dignity, and the child who'd been rejected had found the courage to speak truth to power. "Come on," Thomas said, putting his arms around both Scarlett, me, and Billy as they turned toward the Foundation's brightly lit entrance. "Let's go home. We've got work to do tomorrow. A school to finish, more children to help, a community to transform one heart at a time." Behind them, the desert wind sang its eternal song. But tonight it sounded less lonely, less bitter. Tonight it sounded like hope, like possibility, like the beginning of a story that would echo through generations of children who would grow up knowing that love was always stronger than hate, that family was always more powerful than fear, and that sometimes the people the world throws away are exactly the ones it needs most. The Foundation's doors closed behind them with a soft click, sealing out the judgment and cruelty of a world that had tried to destroy them all. Inside, lamplight spilled golden across polished floors and comfortable furniture, warming the faces of 3 people who'd found their way home through the longest journey of all. The journey from despair to hope, from isolation to family, from the darkness of abandonment to the bright promise of belonging. They were living proof that love could triumph over hatred, that the bonds of choice were stronger than the bonds of blood, and that sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones built from the broken pieces of hearts that had learned to heal together.